Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around, it's Science Fiction Saturday once more. So I've got two science fiction movies for you. One kind of got lost in a very busy year in science fiction. The other one is a bold attempt to do a science fiction comedy, but it doesn't succeed for a couple of reasons I think I figured out. Let's start with the comedy one, because the other one I've got a lot more to say about. 2001, Ivan Reitman tried to recreate the magic of his Ghostbusters movies. He'd had a couple of unsuccessful comedies, but he got hold of a script which was originally intended to be a serious, dark, and kind of full-on science fiction movie. But he got a couple of rewrites done because he wanted to do it as a comedy. Whether that's the right decision or not, I'm not sure, but let's have a look at it anyway. It's a movie called Evolution, which was directed, of course, by Reitman, and it stars David Duchovny, Julianne Moore, Orlando Jones, Seann William Scott, and Ted Levine. And it's a kind of missed opportunity. I think there are a couple of things wrong with it, but I think there's a lot that's right with it. The story's pretty simple. David Duchovny plays a school science teacher, Ira Kane, who used to work at a very high level in military medicine. He invented an anthrax vaccine, which had some unusual side effects, so he got chucked out of the military and he ended up working at a small regional college in Arizona. His colleague, Harry Block, is played by Orlando Jones. He's the school basketball coach and he's a sleazebag. They're trying to recreate here the dynamic between Dan Aykroyd in Ghostbusters and Bill Murray in Ghostbusters, but times had changed and Reitman wasn't quite on board with that. Seann William Scott plays a guy called Wade who's practicing to be a fireman. He's got a fireman test coming up, so he goes out in the desert and sets fire to a shed and rescues a dummy out of it. And just as he does so, a meteor hits and creates a crater, blows his car to hell, blows Dwayne halfway across the desert, and the meteor becomes buried in a cave system underneath that particular part of the desert. Ira and Harry go to investigate and find that the meteor is quite unusual. It's an elongated shape and it's covered in goo and it oozes goo out of it. And this sets off a bit of a red flag for them. So they take some of the goo back to their lab. They find out it's a single-celled organism, and then not too much later it's a multi-celled organism, and they figure out that this stuff is evolving very, very quickly. Of course, the military come on board because they're the military, and they're led by General Woodland, played by Ted Levine, who you might remember was Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. Interestingly enough, he's accompanied by a woman called Alison Reed, played by Julianne Moore, who played Clarice Starling in the Hannibal movie. So both of these people have connections to The Silence of the Lambs. Alison's one of the scientists, and she's got one defining character trait. She's clumsy. She keeps falling over. She's awkward, but she's a very good scientist. Ira and Harry get chucked off the project by the military, and they find out some interesting things about the organism and sneak back into the site and go down into the caves and find out that the thing's evolved even more. There are a whole bunch of flatworms in there. There's a whole bunch of fungi-like structures, and they realise that things are going to only get worse, which indeed they do. The organisms keep evolving until you've got a primate-like ape with no nose, which is quite dangerous. There are insects, there are large carnivorous plants, there are all sorts of things. It's expanding through the cave system to take over various ecological niches. The military, of course, decide they're going to take the thing out with napalm. Almost by accident, Harry and Ira find that that's the worst thing they can do. The military does it, and suddenly they've got a great blobby kaiju to handle. And the state governor, played by Dan Aykroyd, who comes in and does some really nice stuff. He's quite good with the techno-babble, and he's a breath of fresh air in this movie. There's also a couple of very much C students who are helping out Ira and Harry. One of them is played by Ethan Suplee, and this motley crew have to save the world. Now, the movie's got a lot going for it. For a start, Julianne Moore and Orlando Jones know what kind of movie it is and are playing it at the right level. But the big problem is David Duchovny. David Duchovny, as the lead character, has zero risk. He's got low energy. He's not good at selling the jokes. And that drains the movie in an odd way. But the movie does quite well with the special effects work, particularly the computer-generated stuff. For a movie of that budget in 2001, it does really well. That's not surprising because the VFX supervisor in this was Phil Tippett and his studio, Tippett Studios, and they know what they're doing. If you've seen Mad God, the recent movie that Phil Tippett made as a passion project over many decades, you'll know what I'm talking about. The small creatures look good, the big creatures look good, but the whole monster bestiary works really well. There's a prolonged scene in a shopping mall where a four-legged winged dinosaur soars through the shopping centre attacking a shoplifter. The special effects in that are great. They work really well. The shots are selected nicely. They don't try to do anything that's going to make it look artificial, which I really appreciate. I think that there are a lot of movies from around the turn of the millennium where the special effects people weren't quite as adept as they could have been, probably through inexperience and budgetary limitations. But this one does a very, very good job of it for its time. The comedy is kind of hit and miss a little bit. There are some bum jokes which are always welcome. If there's one universal in comedy across many, many cultures, it's bum jokes. And this movie gives us two. One involving Harry and one involving the monster, where the good guys have found a way to kill the monster and they have to deliver the potion. They have to do that in a giant sphincter underneath the monster. One of the hard things is Ivan Reitman's tried to recreate something he did very well decades before. And unless you've got everything exactly right, the ensemble cast, the script, the jokes landing in a certain way, and having a cultural context, the way that all of the New York bureaucratic scenes in Ghostbusters had a cultural context in New York at a time when it was very corrupt and very much almost a bankrupt city. And that cultural context for Ghostbusters in around 1984 gives the movie more verisimilitude. It makes it feel more real, whereas the cultural context in Evolution just isn't there, which is a pity. I think there was a possibility here of having a really interesting science fiction movie with a whole bunch of jokes and a whole bunch of plot beats that really work. And it gives me the idea that maybe Ivan Reitman just didn't understand fully what he had with the Ghostbusters movies, which is kind of sad, but nonetheless, the movie works kind of well, except for Duchovny draining all of the character out of every scene he's in. And in spite of that, I liked it. I think it was a fun movie. The special effects are great. The monsters look good, and it has a satisfying resolution. That then brings me to the second film we're going to talk about, and that film was released in 1980. And 1980 was a difficult year to get a serious apocalyptic science fiction film released successfully to the public. It was the year when Empire Strikes Back came out. It was the year when Flash Gordon came out. It was the year when one of the last Superman movies came out. So there was a lot of fluffier projects which didn't take science fiction anywhere seriously. And to have a very grim and elegiac apocalyptic movie come out, made by a director from a non-English language country, it was never going to play well to the audiences and to the studios in Hollywood. It was released by Toho, but if it ever got a cinema release in America, it would have been very brief. My understanding of it is that it was sold directly to television, and a whole bunch of the end of the movie was cut out for the American release. This movie was based on a 1964 novel by Japanese writer Sakio Komatsu, and it's called Virus. I watched it for the first time yesterday, and it blew me away. I think it is a crime that this movie was buried. The premise of it's pretty simple. There's a virus called MM88, which is a human-created virus, which is stolen by a group of people and carried away. They're going to give it to somebody. We don't know who at the time. But the light plane they're on crashes in the mountains of Eastern Europe, and the virus gets out. Now, this virus is incredibly dangerous. It latches itself onto other viri and changes their DNA, and is 100% lethal to all vertebrate life, which is good for vegetarians, but not necessarily for anybody else, if there are any vegetarians and vegans left. The world starts finding out about it with little obscure things that happen. There's a scene on the plains of Kazakhstan where a shepherd finds all of his sheep dead. There's an outbreak of what they call the Italian flu in Italy, where people are bringing their ill relatives to overcrowded hospitals, and people are dying, and none of the antibiotics they have work on it, none of the vaccines they have work on it. And this slowly spreads across the world. Meanwhile, the President of the United States, played by Glenn Ford, and he does a really good job of the role, has just signed a treaty with Russia where they have automated their nuclear weapons. They can't launch them unless there is a nuclear attack from the other country. The president has some advisors. There's a senator who is a political rival of the president's, played by Robert Vaughn, who warns him of the dangers. There's also a mad army general played by Henry Silva who sets up the nuclear deterrent and sets it up in such a way that if there was a nuclear attack or any kind of rumbling in Washington, D.C., the nukes would all launch.
How long will it take to manufacture this vaccine in quantity?
Mr. President, we have not even been able to isolate the cause. The virus, if it is a virus, is like the common cold. It is everywhere, it is nowhere.
So the virus spreads across the world. We see some chaotic and horrible scenes in Japanese hospitals where people are coming in sicker and nurses and doctors dying like flies. And there's a scene with a dying doctor who looks across the room and sees all of the goldfish in his fish tank are dead as well. So it's affecting all vertebrate life. And a lot of these scenes are very hard to watch. Kinju Fukasaku is the director of Virus. Later went on to make one of the most brutal movies that has come out of Japan in the last 30 years, Battle Royale. And he hits hard when he needs to hit hard. This guy doesn't have any padding in his gloves. He will punch you and make you feel what he wants you to feel. And he does this with these scenes. They probably play a lot harder now that we've been through another pandemic, but he doesn't pull any punches anywhere in this movie. He is true to the premise. He is straight down the line. He doesn't sugarcoat or pad any of the horrible implications of the premise of this movie. And the only places unaffected by this virus are Antarctic bases because the virus won't replicate in cold conditions. And so an alliance is formed of the Antarctic bases into the Federal Council of Antarctica, whose chairman is a military general played by George Kennedy, and he does a really nice job of this one as well. Bo Svensson plays a military commando who has some really nice character beats in there as well, who will James Olmos in an early role. Does really well as one of the people on the Antarctic bases. But as the world slowly dies, and eventually does die, there are some really brutal scenes. The Japanese Antarctic base gets a radio signal from a very young child who is using his father's radio set to try to ask for help. And they try to help this kid by telling him what he needs to do. His parents have died and he's feeling sick. And what they come to realise as the conversation continues is that the kid doesn't know to stop pressing the send button on the radio microphone. So anything they're saying to him, he can't hear because he's got his finger on the send button. And they sit there and listen to this dying child calling out for help. It's a really effective but really hard scene. And I like the fact that Kinju Fukasaku went there. He didn't soft coat that particular scene at all. There's another problem as well because there are 855 men on the Antarctic bases and only 8 women. And they may well be the last people in the human race. And there are some scenes of the people in the Antarctic base meeting and trying to work out how to save the human race by having the women make babies with a wide variety of men. Now, I did my research on this because of that inclination. There's a scientist working out of the University of Strasbourg. His name's Frederick Marin. And Marin worked out the minimum viable number of people you need for, say, a human space colony to thrive without inbreeding. And that number is 98. 49 men, 49 women, all of whom are of breeding age and are fertile to create a viable rebirth of the human race in an isolated context. What makes this movie even sadder for me is that everything they're trying isn't going to work. People didn't know when the novel was written, of course, in 1964. Now, because of some subsidence and some fracking, basically, not too far away from Washington, D.C., there's a major earthquake going to happen in that area, which is an unprecedented thing. And when that does, that automatic reaction system for the nuclear weapons will trigger. And so a suicide mission is planned for a couple of people, one of whom is Bo Svensson's Marine, to travel to Washington, D.C. and disarm the automatic reaction system. So they travel in a submarine to Washington, D.C. and get into the bunker beneath the White House where this device is working. The virologist, and they have to do it in the time so that the Russian nukes are targeted at the Antarctic base itself, where the people are gathered. So the mission's partly to stop the world being blasted with nuclear weapons, but also to stop the base where the remaining humans on the planet are staying. Now, I'm going to do a slight spoiler here. They're not successful, the nukes go off. But there's an icebreaker ship, and the women and a skeleton crew go to Tierra del Fuego with the experimental vaccine to try to establish a colony away from Antarctica and away from the nuclear weapon that's going to blast the base. That's where the American version of the movie ends. All the nuclear weapons go off. The end. That's the one that people saw on American television. The Japanese version has about 12 or 13 minutes more, and that's the part I'm not going to spoil for you. But it ends on a slightly hopeful note, but again, that number of 98 is what's going to destroy the human race. Though the movie makers didn't know that at the time. Now, I like this movie a lot. It's got some really great scenes. It's got some brutal scenes of Tokyo a year after the pandemic, where the whole city is full of skeletons. And that's really effectively shot. There are also some tracking shots across various cities of the world, giving the death tolls in those cities. And they do a really good job of not having a moving thing in those tracking shots. It's all shot really effectively. At the time, this was the most expensive movie produced in Japan. It cost 16 million American dollars, and for me, all of it is on the screen. It's an incredibly deeply realistic movie. There are a couple of hero moments, but there are some scenes, particularly on the Antarctic base, where a discussion is had about how to repopulate using only 8 women. Those scenes are incredibly uncomfortable and incredibly hard, and the characters admit that. And the start of a new civilization has some of the very basic ideas about monogamy and about parenthood totally broken. It's a difficult movie, and it's deliberately so. It really blasts you in the face with the implications of a worldwide 100% lethal pandemic. And the actors give that premise respect in a way that I didn't expect. There are movies like Meteor, for instance, with a meteor coming in on Earth, where Natalie Wood and Brian Keith and Sean Connery are playing it at a certain level and not playing it quite as seriously as they should. Whereas Virus, which came out at roughly the same time, stays true to its premise, punches the audience in the guts very hard, and creates a memorable movie experience. You should see that one. I wish there was a Blu-ray and a 4K of it. If there ever is in the future, I'm going to buy it. So that's it for this time around. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Hit the notification bell. You can support the channel by becoming a channel member, and there are details on how to do that in the video description. You can also support the channel by donating at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. Next up, I've got the second last of my Hidden Gems of Cinema series, where I'm covering the letters U and V, and there should be a little bit of fun with those. Then, of course, we've got Anything Can Happen Wednesday, where I've got some imprint new releases that are a little bit different for this channel, but I think that there's some worthwhile movies in the ones that I've got from imprint. So until then, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch some apocalyptic movies that are very, very different, and I'll catch you next time.